Distinguished colleagues and partners, my name is Temba Kalua. I am the Director for Pact for the Future implementation in the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. It is an honor to share this message with you, and I would like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Coalition for the UN We Need and their regional partners for creating these important spaces for dialogue, reflection, and collaboration. Nearly a year and a half after its adoption, the Pact for the Future is moving from commitment to implementation. It stands as one of the most ambitious global agreements in recent years, designed to reinvigorate multilateralism, accelerate SDGs, and respond to rapidly evolving challenges such as the governance of artificial intelligence. Implementation is advancing across the UN system. The Secretary General Steering Committee, which he chairs, and thematic working groups are driving progress on the Pact's 56 actions. This includes efforts to reform the international financial architecture, as well as the launch of the Independent Scientific Panel on AI and the Global Dialogue on AI Governance. Importantly, implementation is not confined to UN headquarters in New York. Across all regions, UN resident coordinators, regional commissions, civil society partners, and research institutions are localizing Pact's commitments into country-level action and partnership that connect global ambition with local realities. Yet we must acknowledge the significant headwinds we face. Politically, multilateral system is under strain. Geopolitical tensions, declining trust make collective action more difficult precisely when cooperation is most urgently needed. Financially, many countries are grappling with shrinking fiscal space, rising debt burdens. This limits their ability to invest in resilience, social protection, climate adaptation, and inclusive growth. Institutionally, we must continue strengthening coordination across the UN system and ensure that global governance structures are fit for purpose in a rapidly changing world. The Pact for the Future directly addresses these pressures, but meaningful implementation at scale requires sustained political will, adequate financing, and inclusive governance. This is where civil society plays a vital role in ensuring that the Pact delivers real results for people and communities. Regional and cross-regional forums, such as the Future Fora led by C4UN, provide a unique platform for peer learning and collective problem solving. Civil society engagement in these processes ensure that regional perspectives share global implementation and that the Pact commitments are informed by lived realities of communities worldwide. Allow me to highlight three strategies. First, sustained engagement and monitoring. Civil society organizations are essential in tracking progress, identifying gaps, and ensuring transparency. Your independent analysis and field experience help anchor implementation in reality and hold institutions accountable. Second, strengthening regional and cross-regional collaboration. While regions are diverse, we all face shared challenges, from climate vulnerability to digital inequality. Cooperation across regions can amplify civil society's voices and shape approaches that feed into global processes. Third, co-creation of solutions. The Pact calls for inclusive governance. Civil society brings innovation, community knowledge, and accountability mechanisms that are indispensable for designing policies that work, whether on digital governance, climate resilience, financing for development, or youth empowerment. The Pact for the Future is not merely a negotiated text. It is a platform for action and accountability. Its success depends on partnerships across government, the UN system, and civil society. As you look ahead to the Global Futures Forum, the Pact Review in 2028, and the broader reform efforts, including UN80, your engagement will be critical to ensure that global commitments translate into tangible improvements in people's lives. Thank you for your leadership, for your partnership, and for your steadfast commitment to shaping a more just, inclusive, and sustainable future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you to Dr. Kalua for those very powerful opening remarks. He's highlighted several issues that we'll be touching on today. I'm not going to go over what he has said, but I'll now invite Florence Yvon, the co-chair of the C4UN, to give us the welcoming opening remarks. Thank you, Florence. Are you on? Yes, Florence is on. So, Florence, you have the floor.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, just give me a minute. Thank you very much. Just a minute. Thank you, Carol. Thank you to everyone. And good morning, good afternoon to each and every one of you. So it's a great pleasure to be here and also, of course, to give a few welcome remarks on behalf of course, CIFOR-UN and other partners who are organizing this particular event. So thank you very much, Carol, and thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to every person that is here with us. And of course, we are looking forward to a very, very good conversation. And so as we begin this particular webinar, it's important for us to also reflect in terms of where we are coming from and, of course, where we are going. And the regional forums have been very, very instrumental in terms of, just convening at a critical moment for us to reflect on the implementation of the Pact of the Future, as Mr. Themba said. And of course, also on the we have the issues of the ongoing UN80 reforms agenda and the broader question of how we shape a more inclusive, responsive, and people-centered multilateral system. And of course, this is very, very important for Africa. And we welcome this particular meeting on the Pact of the Future, the UN80 and the future of multilateralism. And so as we continue with this conversation, the forum for us will provide an important platform for Africa voices to contribute meaningful conversations linking African, ongoing action to the globe, but also what is the future of multilateralism in Africa, and also how then do we bring experts, civil society organizations, global partners to exchange and to co-create solutions. I think that's what is really, really important. How do we co-create solutions? How do we reflect on the realities, the lived realities of Africa? How then do we aspire so that our continent, of course, is part and parcel of these critical conversations? And so we are saying that this space, like many other spaces, we hope that will bring for us equitable, but also representation that is grounded in lived experiences for the African people. And so I'd like to acknowledge, of course, the collaboration which is happening here today. We have Peace Child International, we have SDG Watch and many others, but of course in Africa, the NGO Council of Nigeria and many others. Thank you for, just coming together and being able to organize this particular initiative and for us to, of course, have a very, very critical conversation ahead of some of the critical things like the high-level political forum that is coming up and also some of the global and regional action that needs to happen between now and then. And so the African Regional Forum, Futures Forum, is part of a broader strategic process under the CIFOR-UN Initiative for the 2020-26. And so the other regions also have had their opportunity or will have the opportunity. And we will need to build momentum around early engagements, including the 2023 and 2024 preparatory meetings that happened, the Summit of the Future, and also for you, those that participated in the UN Civil Society Conference that was held here in Nairobi in 2024. These processes have strengthened collaboration between member states, the UN Secretariat, civil society, for us to create a stronger foundation for continued engagement. And so there's been a lot of this ongoing initiative since February 2024 this year. And we believe that Africa plays a critical role in shaping the global narrative. And of course, these forums are designed to feed into the Global Futures Forum, ultimately into the high-level political forum, as I said. And of course, ensuring that we co-create and we have a people-centered vision for, the multilateral system. And so today's conversation for us in Africa is to ensure that the process is particularly is open and also there's, conversations around innovations, conversations around decision-making spaces, conversations around how then do we ensure that there's inclusion at all levels. There's, how do we ground some of this in terms of the leave no one behind and communities that really matter in terms of, such critical conversations. And so as we move along, I would want to ensure that, or I'd want to say that let's all sort of just ensure that different voices are captured in different ways. I want to encourage all the participants that we don't just stop here in terms of the different regional forums, the conversations happening here, but we need to see a lot of vibrancy at national level. We need to see vibrancy at the regional level. We need to see vibrancy at different countries. And we need to see, what really needs to be done, especially for us as Africans. And as we conclude, as I conclude my speech, I would want to say it's time for us to reflect briefly on insights from the recently concluded the 12th African Regional Forum on Sustainable Development that happened in Addis last week. And one phrase stayed with me throughout the week: Africa is under construction. And I know maybe some of you who were there heard about that. And this was evident both literally and of course in the issues of the evolving skyline in Addis Ababa. There was a lot of cranes field and, new development. And it was really nice for many of us who were visiting Addis after maybe a long time or for the very first time. And so it tells you that there's a big future in Africa. How do we capitalize on our growing population, on our young population? How do we capitalize on the, our African Agenda 2063, our own national agendas, and also the Agenda 2030. And so we hope that as we combine these African regional forums, conversations, that we will bring together all other conversations that have happened last week and many other previous weeks, and also upcoming conversations, and for us to start solidifying what we need to do and what needs to happen here in Africa. And so with that, I want to really say that let this just be a beginning of many, many conversations across Africa. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. We can upload her virtually for really tying in a lot of issues together, and also bringing in the concept of leaving no one behind, because the implementation of the Pact for the Future must involve the broadest range of actors that dot this continent of Africa as is reasonably possible. But she's also brought in something that was spoken to by Temba around collaboration, because the table is normally not big enough for everybody to sit around it. But if we collaborate, we can bring the voices of those who are not in the room to the table. So I'm not going to belabor that point, but I'll move us on to the expert session. Again, to remind those who are joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. The meeting is being recorded, and if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we'll pick it up and direct it to one of the experts, and they'll be able to respond to you. We're meeting to, like I said, look at the implementation of the Pact. And we have an amazing team of experts. And so I'm going to call up our first expert, Oyebisi Babatunde Oluseyi, who's the Executive Director of the Nigerian Network of NGOs, with extensive experience in civil society strengthening and growth. He has worked with the United Nations Children's Fund, and he's been instrumental in growing the Nigerian network of NGOs from 600 organizations to over 3,900. That's great mobilization. He's involved in various initiatives, and he's also a member of the International Board of Directors at the International Center for Nonprofit Law that has contributed tremendously to civil society strengthening. So Oyebisi, please talk to us about Pact implementation. Where do you see the strengths in civil society engagement in Africa? Where are some of the gaps, and what are some of the strategies that we could employ to ensure that civil society is actively engaged in the Pact implementation? So you have 6 minutes. Talk to us.
Yes, thank you so much, Carol. And let me start with a sobering reality in terms of where we are now at this time. I mean, you all agree with me that the SDG itself is off track, and we have only 4 years to the 2030 mark. We still have a financing gap of over $4 trillion per year. And when you look at the challenges we have within our countries at this time, it's still those around debt servicing, which is crowding out education, not leaving any resources for health and infrastructure. And again, when you talk about the overseas development assistance, you all know where we are at now, and the rupturing of multilateralism, how that is affecting the state of play, moving towards the SDGs implementation. But we do have a roadmap. And again, the roadmap itself, these are areas where we've seen the civil society organizations playing a role from the Pact for the Future, even though, that document itself has very little reference to civil society. We also have the Sevilla commitment itself, which was, a commitment on financing for development. Now, that document has moved to the Sevilla platform for action, where we've seen about 123 voluntary high impact initiatives. And I think if there's lesson that we've learned from both the Pact for the Future and our participation within the Finance for Development conversations, is how the space for our engagement as civil society is shrinking, but also how we need to change our strategies of engaging many of those platforms, given some of the realities that we are also seeing, both in terms of funding challenges, but also in terms of how these organizations are also addressing and adapting to the rupturing of multilateralism. It means that we ourselves as civil society organizations, we would have to retool and rethink how we scale up our engagements. Of course, there are 280 concrete actions that may have come out of the Sevilla platform for action. How can we as civil society pay attention to how each one of these concrete actions are now being implemented? And I'm glad that we have the director for the Pact also welcoming us at this session today. But again, in the next last few months, we've seen some level of actions happening on the Sevilla platform for action. I'm not sure many of us as civil society on the African continent are tracking how some of these relates to our work or how it relates to attainment of the SDGs. But so far, there's a report as of April 2026 by ECOSOC, which is looking at the report card of this platform for action, looking at what progress have we seen so far on all of the 280 concrete actions that I mentioned. About 105 initiatives have submitted their progress on this in terms of what they've done so far. 92 of them are showing tangible early results according to a report published by ECOSOC in April 2026. Now, where again we need to pay more attention is in how, one, we bring nonprofit resources to these initiatives, but also how we track them for people and planet. And not just tracking them, how we also provide some level of recommendations as solution and innovative solutions that can help to scale many of these. One that particularly excites me is the Global Hub on Debt Swaps by the government of Spain and the World Bank, which is now operational. And don't forget that if you have followed the news, you would have heard a lot of recommendations from the World Bank to many of our countries in Africa. We need to begin to engage and interrogate many of those recommendations, but more importantly, also see how the debt swap helps our countries to free up resources for education, for health, and also for social protection, as it were. The other that interests me also is that on the South-South Data Community of Practice, which is supporting 66 developing countries as well. Again, how does all of this help us in bringing development to the doorsteps of the common man, particularly looking at the need for us to accelerate action over the next couple of years towards the attainment of the SDGs. For me, I do think that we have some of these foundations being laid, but then financing is, again, a big challenge, particularly across Africa. You are seeing, for example, in Nigeria, we now have a new tax law that is helping to bring as many citizens into the tax net. Fair enough tax processes. Have we seen the same across Africa? And how best do we link all of this as well to some of the recommendations that were made in Spain towards financing for development? But how are we safeguarding also these resources in ways that helps to galvanize infrastructure development, but also ensures that we leave something for those that come in ahead of us? The debt vulnerability remains very high. If you have done an analysis...
Oyebisi, you need to wind down.
Okay, just winding down my thoughts. So again, the debt vulnerability is high, and we need to pay attention to that. How do we help our governments to ensure that they can block illicit financial flows, but also more importantly, advocate for some level of debt management that can free resources as much as possible. So there's a lot of work that we need to do as civil society. And I think the time is for now to ensure that we can track all of these activities as they are moving. They are all moving fast. Now, sometimes it might look like they are slow. For me, I think they are moving fast as, we begin to see them now. However, the movement should lead to concrete action. And that concrete action should lead to what we can track when we see people on the planet, or also when we look at our national GDPs, how, citizens are faring as well. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you, Oyebisi. Again, we appreciate your input into this, your thoughts around the issues that we're discussing, and bringing it to the context of Chapter 1 of the Pact for the Future. I should have pointed out that we have framed the discussion around the 5 chapters of the Pact for the Future, and so we will be looking at the 3 main issues we're looking at from the perspective of the Pact for the Future. So I will call up our next speaker, who is Bitania Tadese, policy specialist. Sorry, her bio is just opening up. Like I said, today I'm having one of those days where technology has played a number on me. Bitania is a peace and security researcher and policy analyst focusing on conflict management and peace building in Africa. She was a program director for Money Africa in Addis Ababa and has worked in various international and Pan-African organizations, including the AU Special Envoy on Women, Peace and Security, and Save the Children International Pan-African Office. She has done a lot of advocacy on women, peace and security, and she holds an MSc in African Studies from Oxford University, a BA in Political Science and International Relations, and an MA in Peace and Security from Addis Ababa University. She'll be speaking to us from the context of Chapter 2 of the Pact, which is on international peace and security. Bitania, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Carol, and a very good afternoon, good morning to you all following us virtually. I will also try to highlight a few actions from the Pact that are particularly relevant to peace and security in Africa, and I'll also try to link them to the specific conflict context we're seeing across the continent, policy responses, and some of them limitations in implementing the Pact. And I'll also try to conclude with a few set of recommendations. I think I will begin with one of the pertinent actions in the 2nd chapter, which is around the protection of civilians in armed conflict, which is a key foundation for a number of peace and security efforts. And despite the strong commitments in the Pact, this particular aspect remains one of the clearest areas of failure by the international community, particularly in the context of Africa. I think the situation in Sudan, for example, illustrates the stark gap, where we have seen repeated and serious violations of international humanitarian law by warring parties, cycles of atrocities occurring across different phases of the conflict. We've seen atrocities committed back in 2023 in El Janina, and there were strong calls for enhanced civilian protection. And despite the commitments that we have seen in the Pact for the Future, we saw another pattern of violence in El Fasher, and there were findings from the International Fact-Finding Mission that point to many of to the acts that may amount to hallmarks of genocide. So really, the protection of civilians is one aspect that is really that requires particular attention within the African context, and from observing a number of conflict and crisis situations in Africa. And at the regional and the global level, again, the implementation of protection of civilians commitment has also been quite weak in terms of the accountability, in terms of responses to such atrocities have been very weak, and both providing measures either by the African Union Peace and Security Council, the UN Security Council, have really fallen short of ensuring effective protection of civilians. And maybe a related subject to protection of civilians is also the evolution of peace operation across Africa. Particularly, there was a commitment within the Pact of the Future of adapting peace operation to existing challenges and realities. And peacekeeping operations at the moment are under immense strain because of the liquidity crisis. UN missions are implementing contingency measures, resulting in the reduction of 25% of troops and civilian personnel across missions, including in major peacekeeping operations in Africa. And there are growing concerns about this cost-cutting measures on peacekeeping efforts, particularly around protection of civilians, around supporting political processes. And while adapting to new realities is necessary for peace operations, but current changes and transitions also risk of weakening missions at a time when they really remain essential tools for managing complex and protracted conflicts. Maybe another policy issue within the peace operations discussion, and one of which is a major priority for many of African member states, the African Union as well, is the Resolution 2719 adopted in December 2023, which provides access to UNSS contribution for African Union-led peace operations on a case-by-case basis. This resolution has not been operationalized since it was adopted in 2023. And there were efforts to operationalize that particular resolution in the case of the AU mission in Somalia. That did not materialize. There was a lack of consensus within the Security Council. So the mission now in Somalia is facing heavy financial shortfalls, and its continued presence in Somalia remains increasingly uncertain. So the peace enforcement part, which was also peace enforcement missions led by regional organizations or sub-regional organizations, has been widely discussed during the time when the Pact was negotiated and when also the Secretary General also released the new agenda for peace. But the trajectory that we are currently seeing after the release of that SG report, but also after the Pact, is that how these regional and sub-regional organizations are also increasingly struggling actually to sustain such kind of peace operations in the continent. Maybe another important, perhaps one area that did not receive adequate attention from many actors, international actors and regional actors, is around sustaining peace and the prevention, prioritizing prevention. There was a lot of discussion on peace operation, on peacekeeping, particularly when it comes to the partnership between the African Union and the UN. While this is widely acknowledged as a critical tool, while prevention remains a critical tool, it really remains under-resourced. And ongoing efforts, particularly within the African Union Peace and Security and governance architecture, really offer some opportunity to strengthen prevention. And there are also some regional initiatives, led by the African Union, particularly in the case of South Sudan, to really put efforts to really greater political backing and sustain investment towards preventive diplomacy. Overall, I think from a civil society perspective, of course, the implementation of the Pact remains really uneven in some of the actions, in some aspects. There is a persistent gap between the commitments and the practice, particularly when it comes to, of course.
Britannia, you need to wind down.
Okay, I'll just wind up with a few recommendations, perhaps. So the gap around protection of civilians, the financing of key peace and security tools, peace operations, but also particularly around prevention. And I think just to conclude on the recommendation part, the role of civil society organizations, particularly on the importance of documenting and sharing evidence, systematically capturing best practices and lessons learned to hold, some of the policymakers as well accountable to the commitments that they've made, and also ensuring that there is a sustained policy dialogue similar to what we are having today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Britannia, and let us also applaud her virtually. It's something that we have to keep learning. I learned the other day, this thing is called what? Whatever, it gets off my mind, yes, but we can do that. So we're going to move on to chapter 3 on science, technology, and innovation, and it will also link up with the Annex 1, which is the Global Digital Compact. But before I introduce our next speaker, I'll just remind us that we can keep the questions coming on the chat, and please continue to introduce yourself in the chat. We are going to have chapter 3 spoken to by Sandra Tombe, who is the executive director of ACONS, which is the Academic Council of the United Nations System. Prior to joining ACONS, Sandra was the affiliate faculty at the Center for Peacemaking Practice at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, where her research focused on migration and displacement, as well as the implications of artificial intelligence in the global South. She has also been a research program officer on learning and evaluation and research at the United States Institute of Peace, where she published several pieces on multilateral regional organizations and managed peacemaking in a turbulent world, a multi-stakeholder initiative examining contemporary peacemaking and the evolving role of the United States and the United Nations within it. She has a very long bio. I'm not going to read through all of it, but Sandra holds a PhD in peace and conflict resolution from George Mason University, a master's degree in French from the University of Louisville, and a bachelor's degree in international relations and French from Berea College. She calls Juba, South Sudan, her home, and the first of many homes, and is fluent in Arabic, Juba Arabic, Bari English, and French. Sandra, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Carol. You did not have to read all of that, but thank you. Jibison, I think I sent you my slides, if you can put that up. Or happy to share as well if I have access to sharing, if that makes it easier.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you, Carol. And thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts on science, technology, and innovation with regards to the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact. My presentation today will focus on kind of understanding the implementation of the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact at a global level, regional level, and then I'll think through the implications of these technologies for the African context more specifically, and conclude with recommendations from a co-authored piece with my colleague Naomi Kilangu, who is from Kenya. I'll kick off with kind of a brief overview of the key action items for the Pact for the Future, and then I'll follow up with the Global Digital Compact. So the Pact for the Future has three actions that focus on a number of really important things globally, but also for Africa more specifically. So it focuses on understanding the benefits of artificial intelligence and technology for people and planet, its implications for developing countries, more specifically when it comes to innovation and building capacities across different sectors. It has implications for human rights, right? It calls for understanding the implications of these technologies for helping push us forward with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. It looks at improving gender equity and ensuring that women and girls are included in the benefits that come from STIs more broadly. It emphasizes the importance of indigenous and local knowledge as communities try to shift towards a technology that really upends lives in different ways. How do we ensure that indigenous communities are able to shape how we govern some of these emerging technologies in specific contexts is one critical call. And lastly, it focuses on international cooperation, cooperation not just between global North and global South actors, but also within regions. So thinking about South cooperation. Next slide. From the side of the Global Digital Compact, there's 5 key objectives that the Compact has, which focus on really overlapping themes. One is on closing all digital divides across different regions, of course, expanding inclusion to benefits that come from the digital economy as more people are now on their phones, especially on the continent. There's a lot of data that comes there. There's a lot of businesses that rely on us being online, right? And so how do you ensure that that is an inclusive market for everyone? Then there's a focus on ensuring that online spaces are safe and secure for everyone who engages in those spaces, and that they do not create opportunities for violating human rights or just our safety and security. Another key objective here is ensuring that there's interoperability of data governance approaches, ensuring that data across regions are held to the same standards that ensure protection of human rights and protections of people who are active in online spaces. And then the 5th objective is to look at international governance of artificial intelligence, which is something that has been really important for the developing context more specifically, mainly because a lot of these debates around how to govern artificial intelligence have been taking place in countries that are producing those technologies rather than those that are consuming it, right? So how do we kind of bridge the divide and ensure that governance reflects the needs of communities that are also using it, but maybe in different ways? Next slide. Now, looking at the implementation of the Pact globally, I'll highlight a couple of specific initiatives that tie the Global Digital Compact and the STIs from the Pact for the Future. The first is the establishment of an independent scientific panel, which took place last year. And the purpose of this panel is to help promote scientific understanding of AI and all its implications for humanity, right? How does it affect our lived experience, our lived environment? How does it affect our ability to work, right? What implications does it have for labor, for mobility, for all of these components? Mainly because this technology is fast changing and evolving, that a lot of us really don't have a good understanding of what implications it has for our lives. So having a community that brings together a diverse set of individuals, and I'm glad to see how representative this panel is of African voices and voices from the Global South, to ensure that our understanding of the risks and benefits of artificial intelligence are representative of the different contexts where we come from and the implications that these technologies could potentially have for us. The second global effort towards implementation is the Global Dialogue on Artificial Intelligence, which just closed actually at the end of April. It called for input from member states, from academia, private sector, and civil society to help inform how different communities, different stakeholders see the benefits and risks of artificial intelligence and what implications it has for our lives, right? If we're looking to govern it for a global audience, then it is important that there's a global input that's coming into shaping how these tools and governance mechanisms can then work out into the future. Lastly, if we can think of these 3 points as a spectrum of real integration and cooperation within the Global Digital Compact and others, I would say the private sector's role in science, technology, and innovation in the developing countries more specifically at this point is a less coordinated effort. It's something that the Pact for the Future and the Global Digital Compact call for, but there hasn't been a coordinated initiative in a sense that ensures the engagement of the private sector with STI sectors in Africa or in Asian and other developing contexts. So this is really more drivers of business interests that are getting some of these companies that are heavily leading really on AI to engage with different contexts. So there's room there to think about what does a coordinated effort look like that helps ensure a more reliable model that engages the private sector with entrepreneurs and developers within the African context. Next slide, please. Then on the regional point, and I'll echo what some of my colleagues have already mentioned, which is that
Sandra, you need to wind down.
Which is that implementation is really slow. And part of the challenge here is that it's really difficult to assess the effects of the implementation of the Pact, given that there's a number of overlapping developments on the continent that speak to these same issues. And in some ways, I don't think this is a problem. I think this is actually a positive thing because a lot of these initiatives, so I'm looking specifically at the African Union Continental Artificial Intelligence Strategy from 2024, which calls for the engagement of the Global South in global governance debates, calls for regional cooperation. And most recently, the Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa, which just released its implementation map, I think a couple of months ago. And we can think of this as really a roadmap for reconfiguring how the Global Digital Compact fits in the context of Africa. So all of those are conversations that are happening at the same time and helping meet some of those needs for the African continent. Next slide. I'll conclude very briefly with two more slides, which is on the key challenges that hinder the implementation of the Pact. A number of my colleagues have mentioned funding. I will add inadequate infrastructure when it comes to technology more specifically. And here I'm thinking of not just digital infrastructure, but also physical infrastructure that connects communities and connects resources to allow ease of engagement with some of these emerging markets and emerging environments. And then lastly, issues around coordination and governance. So we see that there's a number of challenges when it comes to African states actually adopting an artificial intelligence strategy at a local level. It's good to see that over half of the continent has AI strategies, but there's a good number of countries that are still trying to work this out and figure out what implementation looks like at the local level. Then I'll conclude with my last slide, which looks at recommendations. And this draws from my co-authored piece with Naomi Kilongo. And here my call would be for civil society to really emphasize South-South cooperation. Because if cost is a big issue for us, then it's about thinking about how do we lower the cost of investing in technologies and investing in STIs and ensure that African communities are able to do it at a low cost. And then the second part would be to focus on the role of civil societies as oversight units, right, as monitoring and evaluation tools, ensuring that we're able to hold states and non-state actors accountable, and ensuring that we're helping communities manage kind of the negative and the positive effects of artificial intelligence. I'll wrap it up here. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Sandra. We will appreciate you virtually. And I will move quickly to our next speaker, who will be speaking on Chapter 4, Youth and Future Generations, and also looking at the second annex of the Pact, which is the Declaration on Future Generations. Our speaker is Devros Mary Tolley, and I'm privileged to work with her on the board of Femnet. She is a techie and a young person at that. So she must be wondering what's happening with me with all my tech challenges. There's going to be some intergenerational solidarity happening there. So Devros, please come on because I'm having a challenge opening your bio. I will read it when you are done. You are an amazing tech-savvy young leader. Please take it away.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Devros.
Yeah, I'm having some problems with the sun. I decided to be in my space today. So thank you everybody for being patient. So my name is Devros Tolley, and I'm representing the young women of Femnet. And I'm also a software engineer. Thank you, Auntie Carol, for introducing me. And usually people think these two worlds are different, but for the 70% of Africans under the age of 30, they are the same world. For the majority of young Africans, technology is not just a separate tool that they use. It is the primary infrastructure through which we access our education, our income, and our civic rights. And the problem is that the papers like the Pact for the Future talk about us, but they don't always speak to us. We don't, as young people, we don't want to just be a checkbox on the UN form. We want to be architects of the future that actually runs our lives. So the Declaration of Future Generations, it's a great promise, and it says that we matter, and that's very important. But at the grassroots level, it is very slow. So the reality is that, according to ILO, 90% of African women are in the informal work sector without regular pay or social protections. So while we talk about digital futures and the future of young people, many young women are actually choosing between buying mobile data to access these infrastructures or buying a meal. And the gap I see is that implementation is happening in the boardrooms, but it isn't reaching the girls at the last miles, the girls in the rural communities who are actually doing the work. So we have been asked our opinions, but we are not seeing our ideas in the final budget. So I'm actually happy that I went after Sandra, because you could see that what we both spoke, what she's spoken about and what I'm going to speak about are kind of intertwined, because she introduced us to the strategies that are actually being implemented, the AI strategies, the technological strategies. But as a software engineer, I see a danger I believe should be factored in the Pact. And that is AI or technology that actually complicates rather than simplify. For example, first, digital colonization. So right now, I believe we can all acknowledge that data is the new raw material, and it's being exported from Africa without refining it locally. So we, as a grassroots organization, civil society organization, have been asked to digitize their records, but then the data is harvested to train models that are then sold back to us. We become basically unpaid data entry clerks for big tech, and the community we lose control over our sensitive information and our stories. And second, the AI-powered disinformation. Now it is so cheap to use this deep fakes to discredit women leaders, young or old. A single AI-generated lie can bankrupt a small grassroots organization just trying to defend its reputation. And finally, the technical tax. When we mandate smart platforms for engagements, we sideline experts, the community organizers, and we place them with people that just know how to use the software. They are being told to get with the program that they are not prepared or adequately equipped for. And this shifts power away from lived experiences towards technical literacy. And one thing I just want to end with the challenge is that if the tech doesn't understand our languages, our realities, it does not advance us, it actually erases us. And I just have a few short actionable plans, things that I think that it should be factored into the Pact. For example, we need a national oversight. So young women, we should be auditors. We need seats on committees that actually spend the money to make sure that it actually reaches the last mile. The women that are marginalized, communities that are marginalized, and also we need safety by design. We need that every new tech that is being rolled out in the continent of Africa, it must pass through a gender impact test. If it is not safe for the girl in the rural village, it is not ready for Africa. And I also believe that we need a defense fund. So we need a digital defense fund, because most of our lives, we have to acknowledge that most of our lives are spent online, especially for young people. We need a digital defense fund for grassroots activists. When women are being attacked online, they're silenced by tech, they need a place to turn to for help, an established system that can actually help them. They need an established organization, a system that they can turn to for help. So in closing, the UN is turning 80 soon. And by this time, we shouldn't be inviting youth to the table. The youth should be one of the people that help build the table. We are not, because we're not just talking about the future here, we are defending it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Devros. Let's appreciate her. And that's a powerful way to end. Don't invite youth to the table. They should be part of those that are building the table. Quite powerful. So that intergenerational solidarity move must happen very, very soon. So we are going to move to the final chapter of the final chapter of the Pact. And like I said, I was going to introduce to you Devros comprehensively. Unfortunately, my technology is failing me in very many ways. So this is not in any way leaving the young people behind. I have absolute faith in Devros. You have heard her. It would have been good to hear what she's about. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I will read it out to you when that opens. So allow me to now introduce Tim Mureithi, Professor Tim Mureithi, who will be speaking to the final chapter of the Pact, Transforming Global Governance and the Future of Multilateralism. He's the head of Peace Building Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. He's a professor of African Studies and was a member of the high-level panel of African experts on reform of the multilateral system. He's Kenyan. He's a researcher, has authored over 25, an author with over 25 years experience in the fields of peace, security, international justice, governance, and development, has authored and edited 11 books. And at Article 109, he helps build networks with African leaders, government officials, researchers, and civil society organizations. So Tim, tell us about transforming global governance and the future of multilateralism, reflecting on our three issues that we're focusing on today. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. Good to see you again. Good to see other colleagues on this platform. And so after 2 years of the adoption of the Pact of the Future, action point 39, which was very specific in terms of redressing the historical injustice against Africa in the design of the global governance system, with an emphasis on treating Africa as a special case, and also with a focus on the UN Security Council. I would say in terms of its implementation at the global level, it has clearly faltered. The so-called intergovernmental negotiations after 17 years running from 2008 until now have failed to deliver on any really meaningful progress. And at the continental and regional level, obviously the African Union member states have been developing their own so-called African Union model, which is driven by the Committee of 10 of Heads of State and Government working on Security Council reform. And they met in July 2025 in Lusaka to develop the Africa model, which echoes the El Zuwini consensus of 2005. That's 21 years ago, which demands 2 permanent veto seats, 5 non-permanent positions, and with the injunction that the African Union will determine the selection of representatives to the UN Security Council. In terms of geopolitical, financial, institutional, and structural challenges, geopolitically, the standoff amongst the P5 clearly has led to a structural paralysis of the UN Security Council, which remains in deadlock. It's clearly now become dysfunctional, and in Africa, it has very real implications in terms of the conflicts in Sudan, Sahel, Somalia, Mozambique, Eastern DRC. And I would argue that there was a fundamental flaw in the design of the UN, which endowed it with the P5 with a monopoly of power and the ability to, in fact, even sabotage decisions. This means that there are major institutional and structural barriers to implementing the UN Pact for the future, specifically Action Point 39, due to these constraints. The Board of Peace that has been established, which was sanctioned by the UN Security Council, seeks to replace the UN in some people's perspectives. And the liquidity crisis affecting the UN also undermines efforts to achieve the changes that would deliver on the UN Pact of the future. In terms of concrete strategies going forward as civil society, I think we would need to start to push for the implementations of the UN Pact of the future. I think we can no longer continue to bang our heads against the wall and shout from the mountaintop, lone voices in the wilderness. In terms of the future of multilateralism, we are in a rupture and not a transition, and we have to adopt a different strategy. As Africans, we have to remain resolute to demand equality and a democratic and representative, system that includes Africa not as spectators but as active participants. And one element that is already embedded in the United Nations Charter. There's a lot of talk about protecting the United Nations Charter, but when it comes to implementing some of its provisions, you find some reticence, some reluctance, perhaps even some fear amongst member states. And I'm specifically referring to Article 109 of the UN Charter, which calls for the convening of a general conference to review the Charter of the United Nations. This is an inbuilt mechanism that was devised in 1945 and has not been really activated to completion in that period. It requires 2/3 of the UN General Assembly to vote in favor, any 9 members of the UN Security Council. And the important element is that the P5 cannot veto this process. So the General Conference can be convened. And this is also in line with the campaign for UN People's Pact document, which we produced in 2024. And I would refer this document to you. On page 32, we actually make, this is one of the recommendations that we make in that document. And the first step is to really mobilize at least 30 members of the UN General Assembly to invoke Article 109 resolution. And then the target is 129 votes in the General Assembly to launch the process to review and actually lay the foundations for a different future for multilateralism. Ghana recently passed a resolution in the General Assembly on slavery as the gravest crime in the history of humanity, and it managed to obtain 123 votes, amid a lot of opposition. So, achieving 129 votes on a GA resolution like this will require quite a bit of work, but it is not an impossible, target for us to aim for. So civil society actors, as I begin to conclude, like the Article 109 coalition for a renewed UN Charter, which interestingly enough emerged out of the UN Pact for the Future Civil Society Conference in Nairobi, which our sister here, Carol, was in fact one of the co-chairs. The civil society actors working with the Article 109 coalition can actively build a space for member states to come together, to build trust on a consensus of what would a positively renewed charter look like going forward. There are some models already out there. We can definitely address the issue of the system of collective security, the dysfunctionality of the UN Security Council, but we can go beyond that and even address the global financial architecture that also needs to be reformed, the IMF, World Bank, WTO, and also address issues like climate, the climate crisis, and the regulation of artificial intelligence, which didn't feature in the original United Nations Charter. As I begin to wrap up in terms of the time frame that we're looking at, by the end of 2027, the idea is to mobilize as much diplomatic and political support as possible to build confidence around invoking an Article 109 resolution in the GA. By 2028, this should hopefully lay the foundations for the invoking and adoption of a procedural resolution to convene a general conference to review the UN Charter. And then by 2029, 2030, in line with the UN SDG review process, is to already begin and hopefully begin a global preparatory process, including civil society actors across Africa, across the global south, across the world, to develop modalities for these negotiations to begin essentially reviewing the United Nations Charter going forward. I think it's important to mention that from the African perspective, 2026 to 2036 has been designated as a decade of justice for Africans, people of African descent through reparations. So we do need to build Pan-African and global African solidarity networks with our sisters and brothers in the diaspora, including the 22 million African descendants in the Caribbean, 40 million in North America, African Americans, 100+ million Afro-Latinos in Latin America, most of whom were descendants of the victims and the survivors, the victims rather, of the transatlantic slave trade. Africa and her diaspora, I think, then have a really historic opportunity here to remake the world order in a meaningful way that includes the voices of people and helps to transform the multilateral system. And this transformation of the multilateral system is not really a matter of charity from an African perspective. It's not Africa being given a handout, but rather it's a matter of human rights and affirmation of our common humanity going forward. So our call to action to invoke Article 109, convene the conference to review the Charter, is precisely to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And Nelson Mandela was always staunch in advising us that it always seems impossible until it's done. And that's what we should be striving to achieve. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Professor Tim, and for bringing it home very well, and to all our panelists for the very insightful reflections that you have made on the Pact. We have about just under 20 minutes, actually 15 minutes, to take a couple of your questions. We have a few questions that have been brought up on the chat. So I'm going to allow me to pick one or two to make that executive decision, but I'll also ask those who are on the call, if you have a question, do raise your virtual hand and I'll be able to call you up to speak it out. But in the meantime, I will just pick one or two. The first question, and this could be also linked to what Professor Tim has just said, so I'll direct this to you. The Pact for the Future emphasizes revitalizing multilateralism, yet Africa remains structurally underrepresented in global decision-making. What concrete mechanisms are being considered to move from rhetorical inclusion to binding institutional reform within UN governance structures? You've spoken of what Article 109 is doing, but maybe you could speak to what is happening within the UN. And then a second question that I will also pick up is, let's see, I had seen one. Yes, I'll direct this to Devros. Thank you for this important discussion. Given the persistent digital divide across rural communities in Africa, where access to internet connectivity, digital devices, and digital literacy remains limited, what concrete scalable strategies is the UN proposing, or can the UN propose, because you're not with the UN, to ensure meaningful digital inclusion for those underserved populations? and how can local community-based organizations be integrated into the implementation of the Pact for the Future? And then the third question, I believe I will direct this to Sandra. Given Africa's demographic trajectory, how is the Pact for the Future integrating education systems, reform, not just access, but quality, skills, alignment, and governance capacity as a central pillar of global stability rather than a peripheral SDG question? And yeah, the fourth question, I believe, I can give this to Bitania. What are the implications of the Pact on average small NGOs? And how can we level the playing field, especially when you think about this from the UN Security Council, what is being done to look into the equitability of representation so as to get us to sustainable development? If you answer that, I believe that we will probably attract one or two more questions from the floor, and we can then bring it home. Professor Tim, and as you do that to everybody, please also make your final comment, because we will not come back to you after this. Professor Tim, if you can do this in 3 minutes, that would be awesome.
Sure. So in terms of what the UN itself is doing or has been doing, the intergovernmental panel, intergovernmental negotiations on the reform of the Security Council I mentioned have been going on for almost 17 years. And the African continent put its demand for a reform of the Security Council, the African Common Position on the reform of the UN Security Council, also known as the Ezulwini Consensus, which was recently upgraded or updated to the African Union model on the UN Security Council reform. So those are the main processes currently going on within the system. The IGN now is due to consolidate the different models coming from different parts of the world, but it's an extremely slow and laborious decision-making system. For 17 years, they haven't delivered on fundamental change, and I think that's why we are arguing as Article 109 Coalition that it's time to think outside the box. And I believe there's an opportunity with the incoming UN Secretary General, to put this agenda on the table. And one thing that the incoming UN Secretary General could do, in fact, is to raise awareness around this provision, which is in the Charter. It's not an academic provision. It has a real practical and functional utility. It creates a democratic process, because everybody within the UNGA would have one vote to vote during the UN General Conference to review the Charter, which democratizes the process rather than having a process which is controlled by, say, for example, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So that's what's happening, and that's what we're trying to achieve. And we invite colleagues. My colleague E has actually posted on the chat to look at some of the work that we're doing at the Article 109 Coalition, article109.org, and feel free to reach out and engage with us. We're very much keen to engage with as many African civil society actors and organizations as possible to mobilize support for this very important intervention. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Tim. Davros? Okay, maybe Sandra, you could go ahead, as then Davros can come after you.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks for that question. So just note the Pact is really an aspirational document in a sense, right? It's not binding in so many ways. And so what it tells us about education and creating opportunities is really more about encouraging states and member states and relevant stakeholders to take action to ensure that women are included in science, technology, and innovation initiatives, to ensure that opportunities are as accessible as possible to marginalized communities. But there's no action that the Pact empowers a state to do. It encourages states to do certain actions. This is all to say that the pact is great. What's happening at the AU level is also great. But at the end of the day, implementation is about what a state does within its locality, right? It's about being able to translate some of these encouragements, some of these aspirations into real and felt changes locally, right? So improving our education system, and ensuring that opportunities are available for people at a local level, because all of these kind of international, global, regional initiatives and documents are only going to be translated local, and that's when we will see impact. I will add that as much as I think AI has a lot to do for us going forward, it will change the future. There are negative consequences and there are positive ones. But it's one thing to work towards ensuring that we have an artificial intelligence strategy as an African state, and it's something else to actually work on the building blocks and the foundations of AI, which is education, infrastructure, health. All of these things still need to be worked on and be invested in. AI is not going to fix all of those issues. And so this question, I think, goes to the underlying components that enable development, and AI is not going to fix all of those, right? So we have to also invest in these building blocks as African states. And then if I could speak, I'm not sure if the voice is back, but really briefly on the question on access in rural communities. That's a really well-noted point. Again, I guess the response on the Pact being really a document that needs to then be actualized also applies here. But I would note that, Rachel, which is a way of being able to use technologies in rural areas without needing to have access to the internet is really critical, but you still have to be close enough to a space where you can go and connect to the internet and download information that you could then access when you don't have internet connection. So there's a lot to be done there in terms of infrastructure, just to ensure that all barriers are erased. But for the time being, that is a solution that individuals in rural communities can rely on for access to information at this time.
Thank you, Sandra. I see your hand, Aluwalia. I'm only seeing part of your name. So I will come to you in a short while. We will have Davros and Britannia respond to the questions, and then I will have you ask your question. Arti, yes, now I see your full name. Britannia?
Yes, maybe for responding to the question on the impact of the Pact on NGOs, I think I agree with Sandra in terms of Pact being this aspirational kind of document. So it's very hard to really assess the actual impact, the concrete impact on actual NGOs. But maybe just one thing that I wanted to highlight in relation to the international peace and security, in relation to the role of the Security Council, is the importance of various civil society organizations that have in the past, for example, briefed the Security Council in different instances on different conflict situations. And civil society actually bringing particular voices from affected communities by conflict and crisis to the Security Council. I think that is something that needs to be sustained, particularly as we're seeing a lot of divisions within the Security Council. The voice of civil society organizations, their expertise, their knowledge, their insight is really important for policymakers sitting here in New York. And the other point, that also to reiterate what Tim mentioned, particularly around the selection process of the new SG, I think that is of particular interest, I think, for Africa and what that means for the partnership, for example, between the African Union and the UN, but also how the new SG really envisions its action or its leadership towards Africa, the priorities for Africa. So really, I think that's something that would be of interest for many civil society organizations, member states from the continent to really follow closely. Even, of course, that selection process really remains in the hand of a few member states, but I think being really informed of the whole process and understanding, what the new leadership would bring for the continent, I think it's also good for CSOs to be quite engaged in that process.
Okay, thank you very much, Britannia. I'm not seeing Davros. I don't know if you're still on the call, Davros. I'm not seeing her. So we'll take the question from Arti, And if Devros is able to log back in, then she will respond to the question. Arti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, all the panelists, for literally convening this discussion, because in 2024, so I was in Nairobi, and I'm from India, and I've been working with the Economic Social Council, writing papers for the High-Level Political Forum and the SDG Summit. So action item 24, which under peace and security is about transnational organized crime, I think becomes a centerpiece for us as far as institutional course correction is concerned. So when you look at the most marginalized and the vulnerable communities, and they exist between Africa, between India, and the rest of the world. I mean, no country as of today is bereft of that population. I think everybody who's asking a question about education and what should be the pathway, I think Sandra would agree, and Tanya and Tim and even Deborah, I think we all spoke about artificial intelligence. So I recently conducted a forum on geopolitics and AI, where we're looking at techno-states and the rise of techno-states. So when you talk about multilateralism, I think that is what is governing the kind of multilateralism we have on Earth. And we're not far from reaching the, even the lower Earth orbit and deep space in terms of the kind of multilateralism we have. So I think the absenteeism of the guardrails for us as a society globally is something that we should be concerned about. So having written for the SDG Summit and High-Level Political Forum, I think these documents just go into the black hole, because there's no deliberation happening, there's no readability, there's no build-up happening from the civil society contributions. So I think that is one of the most important things that we need to really look at. And I mean, I can say this because honestly, I've worked across terrorism, I've worked across prison reforms, I've worked across suicide prevention, gaming addiction, technology addiction, you name it. Because when you look at the deficiency of us, I think there's a comfort we've developed with neglect. The comfort that we have with neglect, may it be ecology, may it be each other, may it be animals, may it be Earth, may it be outer space, may it be our future. I think that is something that we really need to rein in terms of defining a code of conduct for humanity 2.0 as we're moving into the future. So I don't really have a question, but from my experience, I'd love to sort of contribute to this forum and the kind of work that we're doing. And something comes to my mind from the Civil Society Development Conference in Nairobi. I'm forgetting the name of the lady, but she was the director for the General Assembly at one point of time. And she said the global South is no longer the global South, but the global majority. I think that is something very, very powerful in terms of understanding our life location in the current times and how we are progressing into the future. When we talk about artificial intelligence, that's just the last point I'd make, that where are the data centers for the aggregation of the collective human wisdom? They are absent. There are no data centers. It's almost like we wanted to create an exoskeleton for ourselves to carry us into the future. So I think this is a very important time in the life of the world for us to take a breath and say, let's pause. Let us understand what unity is about. We call it United Nations, but it's not a body separate from us. It is a collection of us as nations. Thank you so much for letting me speak and sharing my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Arti. That is well taken, and quite a few issues that you raise, especially the issue of organized transnational crime. Oluseyi, maybe you could give us your final thoughts on any of the questions that were raised. I know I did not direct any to you for a reason. He is one of our co-conveners, but to give you a chance as a panelist to just speak to any of the issues that have been raised very briefly, and then we'll bring it home.
Yeah, I think very briefly, one comment that resonates so well with my thinking and how we can shape things going forward is the one that I'm going to read from ETA. It says, it needs to be remembered that the implementation of the 2030 agenda is the responsibility of the member states and not the UN as mandated by the agenda. This then means that as civil society, we must engage with national governments on what the priorities should be, from the ministries responsible for development to those responsible for foreign affairs. We should start from home and then look at regional blocks that would also help us in being able to shape many of the priorities that we would like to see and, the implementation priorities, as it were, before we then get to the United Nations. I think our work is already edged out for us as civil society organizations. We now need to move with great speed from, just talking to acting, and that acting would also require us being strategic, being also collaborative, and where we also need to confront the system we confront, but also balance that confrontation with collaboration. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Oluseyi. Davros is back. Davros, are you there?
Yes, Auntie Carol, I'm here.
Okay. There was a question that it has been responded to, but probably if you could give us some of your final thoughts as we wind up this panel. If you're speaking, you're on mute, Davros.
Yes, my final thoughts. My final thoughts are I'm so happy with the Pact and what we are, that young people, we are in the conversation. But I just want to emphasize that, as I said earlier, that we should be in committees. We should be in committees where the funding is, so that we can make sure that it reaches to the grassroots level. And we should be in the rooms where decisions are being made, and not just being invited for as consultants. We should actually be auditors. So those are my final thoughts, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Davros. I still have not been able to call up your what do you call it? Your bio, but this is to just say, where I think it's coming up. So very quickly, Davros is a front-end engineer and youth advocate, passionate about digital equality, feminist leadership, and the power of inclusive tech. With a first-class BSc in computer science from Lancaster University, Ghana, has mentored dozens of early career technologists. She's a very young lady, but she's already mentoring through company-led boot camps and academies, helping more young women build confidence and skills in tech spaces, and is the young women representative on the board of Femnet, and works at the intersection of technology, gender, and community, focused on creating spaces where African women can lead, build, and belong. So I have been true to my promise to you, Davros, and I think it was important that we hear that. So as we come to the close of this panel, I'd like to just say very quickly, it will be very difficult to summarize everything that has been said in about 5 minutes, but to just pick up a few things that have popped out for me. One is accountability, and it is the responsibility of member states to ensure the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, in Africa, Agenda 2063, the Pact for the Future. And accountability means that they must do what they said they would do. How do we get them to do this? We have to bring the Pact home. We have to bring the Pact and all these regional instruments home so that they are then bound by the laws that harmonize or domesticate these global and regional commitments. We also spoke about the issue of the debt burden. This is a reality for Africa. And how do we bring in the issues of tax governance into the accountability space? In my country, Kenya, we are totally burdened by the taxes. We do not see a commensurate, provision of service coming out of those taxes. And we also know about the debt burden in a lot of our African countries. We've spoken about closing the digital divide, and this has been an interesting conversation. How do we ensure more CSO engagement, but also how do we build data into everything that we do, because we had that data is a new raw material. so that we're then also safeguarding our rights as the citizens of Africa and to minimize on the data harvesting. I'm just speaking randomly from the notes that I made. We're in a rupture. We must demand equality for Africans as active participants. And we must also push for justice for Africa and people of African descent, not from a charity point of view, but as citizens who have a right to that table. And talking about tables, we must bring in the youth, but not only as decorations around the table, but to build the table as well, to construct that table, to frame the issues that will be brought at the table, for discussion around the table. And talking of youth, Africa is a young continent. I'd be remiss if I did not bring in the fact that Africa is aging and Africa will be an old continent very soon. We will have, the way we have a youth bulge, we will have an aging bulge. The divide between the two is hardly being spoken about, and we need to bring that to our consciousness as we talk about development on the continent, so that we're talking about issues of social protection in real terms. Florence did mention at the beginning, Africa is under construction. That is a fact. But how are we constructing for an age-friendly Africa in all ways, not only from the infrastructural perspective, the physical infrastructure, but also the moral infrastructure, the digital infrastructure? And how do we ensure that the CSOs who are a power to reckon with on this continent are able to bring the voice of the CSOs is brought to the table, and the evidence that the civil society generates from the communities that they work with is brought to the priorities, to shape the priorities for the continent. Like I said, it is not possible to adequately summarize the richness of this conversation in a few short minutes. We will be having the Africa Futures Forum in the last week of May. That is the week starting 25th of May. We will communicate the date to you very, very soon. And we hope that you will be able to continue with this discussion. We believe it will be we'll be able to build on what we have evoked today and be able to come up with some very workable recommendations that can take us forward.